Caesar Kleberg is the father of wildlife conservation in Texas, as was decreed by the Texas legislature in 2009. Born in Quarrel, Texas in 1873, he went to work at the age of 27 for Henrietta King, widow of King Ranch founder Richard King. While overseeing the Norias division of King Ranch, he observed wildlife was disappearing due to unregulated hunting and set groundbreaking hunting regulations in 1912, 20 years before Aldo Leopold wrote Game Management, the pivotal book on managing and restoring wildlife. Kleberg was appointed to the Texas Game, Fish, and Oyster Commission in 1929, serving on that predecessor of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for more than a decade, where he helped enact statewide hunting regulations. His conservation accomplishments ranged far beyond King Ranch, as he was also a guiding influence for the passage of the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act of 1934, known today as the Duck Stamp Act. Before his death in 1946, he drafted his will, which created the Caesar Kleberg Foundation for Wildlife Conservation, which over the past 60 years has bequeathed more than $40 million to wildlife research projects worldwide, and in 1981 led to the creation of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M Kingsville. And in addition to his remarkable conservation legacy, he was also instrumental in the success of King Ranch as a cattle empire and renowned horse breeding business. The definitive biography of the remarkable life of Caesar Kleberg was written by Duane Leach, former president of Texas A&I University, now Texas A&M University-Kingsville.
Caesar was born in 1873, and he was the first of 5 children. His father was a distinguished attorney, a congressman, a newspaper editor. The Klebergs were dedicated to learning and education. The early Klebergs, who came in 1834, were known as Latineers or intellectuals. The first thing they did when they got to the United States was found a school. Caesar grew up in a little town called Quarrel, and his father was the editor of the paper and so on. And for a period of time, he just lived a kind of semi-agricultural life in a tight German community. One of the things about Caesar that's interesting is he was devoted to his family. The children were very close. There was a tight family bond. After he graduated from high school, he went off to St. Edward's for a while, and he wasn't happy at St. Edward's. His father had great hopes that Caesar would be an attorney, but that didn't work. He was there just only a brief time and began to write his parents and say, "I'm never going to be a part of indoor life. I need fresh air and breezes."
Although he never graduated from college, among his many accomplishments would be to one day play a pivotal role in founding Kingsville and helping to bring Texas A&I College, now Texas A&M University-Kingsville, to South Texas. Caesar Kleberg would find a lifetime of fresh air and breezes on the largest ranch in Texas. Located in deep South Texas between Corpus Christi and Brownsville, King Ranch sprawls across 825,000 acres. King Ranch was founded by Richard King in 1853 when he purchased the Rincon de Santa Gertrudis on Santa Gertrudis Creek, 124 miles north of Brownsville. At the time, the vast untamed territory was known as the Wild Horse Desert. Nearly a half-century after the founding of King Ranch, when Caesar Kleberg arrived, the ranch lands retained much of that essential wildness, and today the sprawling country remains a haven for wildlife. Fred Bryant, Director of Development at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute, appreciates what a unique region this encompasses.
And South Texas is a special place, as you know. We call it the last great habitat for a reason. It's one of the most biodiverse regions in North America, but the truth is that it has more species of plants and animals than any place else in Texas. But somebody had to start being the Aldo Leopold for South Texas, and that's what Caesar was. We call him the father of wildlife conservation in Texas because of his tremendous legacy of management, conservation, and those things that are dear to all of us.
In 1873, the same year Caesar Kleberg was born, Richard King purchased a portion of the San Juan de Cadecitos land grant from which the 230,000-acre Norias division of King Ranch would be formed. King Ranch consists of 4 divisions: the original Santa Gertrudis, Laureles, Encino, and Norias. It was to the Santa Gertrudis that Caesar came to work in 1900. His uncle, Robert Justus Kleberg Sr., had married Alice Gertrudis King, daughter of ranch founder Richard King, 4 years earlier, but it was Henrietta King, widow of Richard King, that hired Caesar.
He never worked for Robert Kleberg Sr. He worked for Mrs. King. His first salary was $75 a month. When he died in 1946, it was $5,000 a year.
Caesar not only helped to develop the railroad south to Brownsville, but he began selling land for the ranch in the early days, and he started working in the cattle herds. In 1903, Caesar Kleberg became an incorporator of the railroad that ran through King Ranch. A railroad hotel built for potential land buyers was located at the Norias Division, some 50 miles south of King Ranch headquarters.
In 1908, the Norias became the center of the Southern Ranch, and that became the world-famous Hotel Caesar, where Caesar greeted everyone. Everybody came to see Caesar. The world beat a path to his door. Roy Rogers, Will Rogers, Edward Guest, Jack Dempsey, John Nance Garner, Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson. They came down, and the place had no running water. What you did if you stayed down Caesar, there were cars spurred next to the place, and you got your bunk out in one of the cars. But people loved it, and they loved Caesar because he was such a genuine person.
Theo Kleberg, King Ranch heir, has great admiration for Caesar Kleberg.
And you think about him living 60 miles south of Kingsville on a sand road before the highway and the railroad were put in. Even though he was in a remote location, lived by himself, the influence that he was able to have, and a lot of it was that people wanted to come visit Caesar. And of course, his father had been in politics. Caesar would go up there and see him and work with him on a period of time. But he made friends, and those friends would want to come visit him. And of course, who's not wanting to come to Norias, you know, in the middle of the wild horse desert, to get away from Washington D.C. or Austin, Texas, and come spend some time with Caesar, seeing what he sees.
Caesar understood after he'd spent all that time in Washington that the King Ranch would need friends well beyond South Texas. And Caesar became the man who handled all the political problems.
Caesar seemed to have an innate understanding of what was needed at King Ranch in every facet, from cattle to politics. In 1912, he became superintendent of the Norias, the sprawling southern division of the ranch.
And he began to notice that game was disappearing, that the deer were gone, the turkey were gone. So in 1912, he made a historic, really, difference in the future of the King Ranch. He instituted hunting rules and said deer can't be shot in the time of rut, and deer can only be shot in the head and neck, quail can only be shot in the covey rise, and no hunting around watering holes. The reason that's so significant is that his aunt and uncle instituted those same rules ranch-wide. No free hunting anymore, which was a great change on Santa Gertrudis. What that really did, and why it is so significant, is it put King Ranch on a dual track, not only to become a great beef-producing giant, but ultimately a wildlife paradise.
Guests and employees had to abide by the strictly enforced hunting regulations, and wild game began to rebound on King Ranch, while outside its boundaries, wildlife continued to decline. He also started habitat restoration on the ranch, and windmill-driven water wells were adapted to make water available for wildlife year-round. These combined efforts brought success, and in 1925, the state officially designated 414,000 313 acres of King Ranch as a Texas state game preserve. Several years later, deer and turkey were so abundant that many were captured for restocking efforts elsewhere in the state.
We're blessed to be a group of people that wakes up every day worrying about wildlife. And we believe that's what Caesar did every day, because from the time he came here in 1900, he loved South Texas and he loved the wildlife. And he worried about all of them, and he worried about them in a big way. And so his legacy is the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. Caesar, being on King Ranch, brought some conservation to a family that at that time, cattle was all they could think about to make a living. The thing about Caesar, I think that is remarkable, is when you're the first to bring up different concepts and new concepts that could be controversial, which Caesar did. It takes a lot of guts to bring out conservation measures that, at that time, wildlife were marketable. They were killed and sold in the open marketplace. So here he's saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to conserve them. And to even bring that thought process into this part of the world, to me, took a lot of guts. And so I admire Caesar just for his willingness to stand up and say this is wrong.
Caesar believed that if you listened to nature, it would speak to you. And that's why he always said, the wild horse desert has a way of talking if you'll only listen. And he wanted to understand their wiles and ways, and he did. And really, he was way ahead of any of the people who were doing any kind of research and the need for wildlife.
In later years, he hired Val Lehman as the first wildlife biologist on King Ranch.
And Lehman makes a marvelous statement at that time. He said, that was the first time I had ever heard anyone talk that one day wild game would be more profitable than cattle. And it came to pass, of course.
T.O. Kleberg has seen Caesar Kleberg's vision become a reality.
But you look at what hunting leases command today in South Texas, it's far and above what you can get for cattle ranching. So it's been an added profit center, if you will, to someone that has cattle. You got cattle as one profit center, you got wildlife as another, and I'd say wildlife is more important. You have to manage it, but it doesn't take all of the inputs that cattle, and on a per acre basis, wildlife will generate more than cattle.
You know, the fact that he convinced Bob Kleberg Jr. to hire the very first wildlife biologist to be on a working ranch was revolutionary, and that was in the 1940s. And today, everybody has a wildlife biologist that works on their ranch and runs their operations in many cases. So wildlife has become the driver, if you will.
Caesar Kleberg's influence went well beyond King Ranch, as his observations of wildlife, and in particular the diminishing numbers of migratory waterfowl, helped convince U.S. Congressman Richard Mifflin Kleberg to sponsor the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act.
That they were worried about some of the migratory birds as well. And his father had been in Congress, Rudolph had been in Congress, and through Rudolph and my grandfather, Richard Kleberg Sr., they enacted legislation which was the duck stamp as we know it today, for the preservation of wetlands and the migratory birds. So Caesar was involved not only in the game that was here in South Texas, but he was very observant of the migratory game that came and left Norias his home.
Following passage of the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act in 1934, all hunters of migratory waterfowl would be required to buy duck stamps to qualify as legal hunters. Monies generated from the sale of the stamps would be dedicated to waterfowl habitat and maintenance. Since passage of the duck stamp in 1934, more than 5.7 million acres have been acquired using federal duck stamp revenues. More than 300 national wildlife refuges were created or have been expanded using duck stamp dollars. At least one refuge in nearly every state has benefited from funding. While Theo Kleberg's grandfather and others were inspired by Caesar's efforts to protect and nurture wildlife on the expansive range of the Norias, Caesar's dramatic impact on conservation would continue on after his passing, thanks to his bequest that would provide the funds to create the Caesar Kleberg Foundation for Wildlife Conservation. Caesar Kleberg was a visionary and a transformational figure. His groundbreaking conservation ideas influenced not only his generation, but continue to influence those of generations to come.
In 1939, he made his last will and testament. And at that time, he put aside amount for $10,000, and he had a little land, a couple of holdings, mineral holdings, and he put it all in this estate. And what happened is that estate became the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Conservation Foundation.
He felt like the conservation of wildlife was so important to all of this area, and obviously dedicated his entire estate to that resource.
The Caesar Kleberg Foundation for Wildlife Conservation was established in Caesar's will, and from that was created the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute in 1981. The Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M University-Kingsville is the leading wildlife research organization in Texas and one of the most respected university wildlife programs in the nation.
We're basically a privately funded institute embedded in a public university, which is a little different model. There's not many programs like this in the country. Most of our funding comes from private donations and gifts and sources. And we worry about mainly terrestrial wildlife, from endangered species like ocelots to hunted species like dove, quail, deer. A lot of wildlife programs in the United States have lost their compass. They don't do much on hunted species, yet hunters are the ones that save the habitat, save the land. If it wasn't for hunters, we wouldn't have the resources we have today.
The Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute is devoted to conducting applied wildlife research with a focus on South Texas. The research is used by ranch managers, hunters, and ranch biologists to sustain and enhance wildlife on their properties. More than 90% of all research projects take place in South Texas. The Institute has a deep and abiding respect for the ranching heritage of South Texas.
So the other part of this last great habitat are these great private landowners that have owned this land for generations, back into the 1700s, and it's hard to appreciate how much they care about this land and the wildlife that live on it. They are great stewards.
With the vast majority of remaining wildlands in Texas in the hands of private landowners, this is where the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Institute focuses.
There's a deep love for South Texas from all these ranches: King Ranch, Etruria, Kennedy, Guerra, all the ones that we know, McAllen, the list goes on and on, East, they're all tremendous landowners. And so we're in a region where, number one, landowners care about their land, they're stewards, and they care about the habitat. And so what the Institute does is we try to understand how wildlife tick down here, and then think about management and conservation efforts.
The reach of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute encompasses an immense swath of South Texas.
We cover a region that's about 32 million acres, we think, thereabouts, from Del Rio to San Antonio to Victoria and south. And we do go all the way into Mexico with some of our studies.
If it is a species of wild animal that walks, crawls, or flies somewhere in South Texas, the chances are that a scientist at Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute has probably studied it. Research programs involve upland game birds such as quail, turkey, and doves. White-tailed deer are a primary focus, as they are of great economic value to landowners and the hunters that pursue them. The wild cats of South Texas, especially the endangered ocelot, have been intensely studied for decades. Biologists estimate that less than 75 of the rare cats remain in the United States, on remnants of thick chaparral in southernmost Texas. Dr. Mike Tuas and his students monitor the elusive cats on private lands where the majority of the remaining ocelots reside. Research on native habitats is of great importance, and the propagation of native plants for revegetation efforts is ongoing. Coastal wetland ecology and bird migration are also focal points, particularly since wind energy development and other threats to coastal areas have emerged in recent years. Wildlife health, especially from the standpoint of disease and parasites, and livestock-wildlife interactions are also being studied.
In which it's grown now to 18 or 19 scientists in every discipline that we have, from native grasses to songbirds, to research those particular individuals and habitats throughout South Texas.
Since 1982, Institute scientists have produced 24 books, more than 800 peer-review articles, and in excess of 500 articles for popular literature such as magazines. Every one of these books and articles has at least one thing in common. Each one has Caesar Kleberg's name in the address on the author's byline. Caesar Kleberg's legacy lives on, and it lives on around the world. But perhaps the most important accomplishment is the inspiring of the next generation of wildlife professionals. Students who depart Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute achieve great deeds for wildlife throughout the world. They continue Caesar's vision. Caesar Kleberg's conservation legacy is unsurpassed in Texas, and his positive impact on King Ranch in all facets was remarkable. He truly was an individual of multiple talents.
People didn't realize the amount of responsibility that Caesar had. He ran the whole Norias operation, plus he handled all the hunting assignments. When people came to hunt, Caesar made sure they got to some place, were taken care of. He handled the whole thing.
During the early days on the ranch, Caesar was behind nearly every major decision. This included establishing the seed stock for King Ranch quarter horses and helping develop the famous Santa Gertrudis, the first beef cattle breed ever produced in America.
There's the question, who really took the ranch into Santa Gertrudis using Brahma cattle? The people I talked to and interviewed said it was Caesar. Now, Caesar never took credit for it, but he was there.
When Caesar Kleberg arrived at King Ranch in 1900, legendary ranch manager Bob Kleberg was only 4 years old. Caesar became his mentor, a fact the strongly independent Bob Kleberg readily acknowledged.
When Caesar died, Bob said, other than my immediate wife, Helen, Caesar was my closest confidant.
Caesar and my grandfather, Dick Kleberg Sr., were contemporaries, and Bob was 10 years younger, so when my grandfather went to Congress, Caesar was here. And so Caesar was really Bob's mentor. And also my father, when Dad came back here in the 40s, Caesar was starting to fail in health. But any questions they had of Caesar, and even into the breeding of cattle and horses, Caesar was a student of that. And so they would go to him with particular issues or questions, and they relied on Caesar's judgment and character to give him the right answer.
Mr. Caesar, or Uncle Caesar as he was fondly known, was the most beloved man on the ranch.
Helenita Kleberg Groves told me, she said, I never heard a bad word spoken about Uncle Caesar. And I'm quoting her now. She said, he spoke sparingly and softly, and everyone listened to him, both inside and outside the ranch. Caesar was behind nearly everything, but the difference was when publicity shined, when they got the cameras and the lights came on, Caesar was not ever out in the front row. He stood back in the reflection of that light.
Caesar Kleberg died a lifelong bachelor in 1946, and while he left no immediate family, his conservation legacy thrives with future generations. Chris Kleberg, T.O. Kleberg's son, is now serving with his father on the board of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute and working to ensure that Caesar's legacy continues.
I think that legacy has carried forward and will be impactful on future generations. I take it seriously, and I've seen the impact, fortunately having grown up here on the ranch and in Kingsville, seeing the evolution and the importance of the decisions that are made today and the impact it has on the future.
Caesar was both a visionary and a transformational figure for the King Ranch. And of course, this estate that he set aside has made possible, the foundation. And of course, the foundation has made possible the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute.
Caesar Kleberg, the father of wildlife conservation in Texas, believed that if you listened, nature would speak to you. And he often said, the Wild Horse Desert has a way of talking if you only listen. He listened intently and passed his heartfelt knowledge to future generations through his extraordinary vision of conservation. The foundation he created and the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute that followed ensure that Caesar Kleberg's legacy will continue for generations to come.